July 31st, 1914 was one of the hottest days on record in Paris, France. It was so hot that it wasn't until after the sun went down that most Parisians went outside and started to have supper, dinner, whatever you want to call it, and talk about the issues of today. At a little cafe called the Croix de la Croissant in mid-Paris, there gathered a group of men who were led by a guy by the name of Jean Jaurès. Jean Jaurès was not somebody who I would agree with politically. He was a socialist. He was a borderline communist. But mostly what he was at that particular point in time was an anti-war advocate. He was someone who believed that wars were fought by governments for the very purpose of suppressing internal rebellion and internal dissent. He was a firm believer that capitalism was the source of all war. Obviously, I don't agree with him on that, but his idea was that the impending difficulties between Germany, Austria-Hungary on one side, Russia, France, and England on the other, were rooted not in politics per se, but in the idea that these leaders were crazy people and that young people, the workers, were going to be sent to die for them. In that sense, he wasn't wrong per se. He had spoken out vehemently against the war, and in fact, one of his plans was to call for general strikes in every country, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, England, because the general idea was that if no one would fight, the governments were going to be left with holding their hands. There's a anti-war poster from the 1960s. Some of you are old enough to remember this. What if they gave a war and nobody came? And it was almost Jean Jaurès' idea. If they want to have a war, let them go fight it. Why do we have to go do it? And he was starting to gain a good deal of influence, enough that the French government threatened to have him arrested for sedition, because there was a great deal of élan, I guess, spirit. There was a great deal of what my good friend, the milsurp writer, Mike, has called Kriegsgefahrsustand, which is this spirit of war, this spirit of the danger of war. It's not an exact translation of the word, but it's pretty close. This danger, this desire almost to have war. And as Jean Jaurès gathered that evening, there were many around the world who saw him, Jean Jaurès, as literally the last hope for peace. As July 31st finally began to cool off that evening, it was a time when all the great powers were mobilizing. Britain seemed paralyzed. It was unsure what they were going to do. They were being asked every day by every power, what are you going to do if this happens? Are you going to stand against Imperial Germany, or are you going to remain neutral? And Britain, which was conflicted herself, what do we do? Do we fight just because we need to fight? Do we fight because of treaties? What do we do? In general, their position was Belgium neutrality was the key. If Belgium neutrality was violated, they were obligated to come to the side of Belgium, whomever invaded it. If Imperial Germany invaded or if France invaded, Britain was treaty obligated to defend Belgium against either side. There was a great deal of confusion. There was a great deal of argument. There was a great deal of hope. Maybe we can avoid this. Jean Jaurès was seen as one of the leaders of the are we insane? Are we really going to do this movement? Yes, he was a socialist. Yes, politically, I vehemently disagree with him. But on July 31st, 1914, he was right. That evening, they gathered for dinner at the Café de Croissant in Paris, France, which, by the way, is still there. You can go see it. In fact, there's a plaque on the wall that commemorates what was about to happen. Jean Jaurès went to the dinner there, and at 9 o'clock, they opened the wine bottles and dinner was served. At 9:40 p.m. Paris time, July 31st, 1914, a man walked up to the table where Jean Jaurès was sitting, and from behind he shot him in the back twice. And 5 minutes later, the last great hope for peace in Europe in 1914 was dead, assassinated. The assassination, of course, was worldwide news. August 1st, which was a Saturday, the July 31st news, Russia declines to answer Germany. All Europe sees clashes inevitable. German squadrons were holed up. New York exchange was closed to avert panic. There was all kinds of belief that we were about to go to war. And the Jean Jaurès assassination, of course, made the front page of the New York papers. But it's an interesting headline. Jaurès laid low by Paris assassin. But if you read the tagline closer, you'll notice that they use a certain word in here that's strange to me. Great French socialist leader, deputy and anti-war agitator, shot to death as he sits in cafe with party of friends. It's an interesting word, isn't it? Agitator. Because we don't think of agitator as a positive thing. It's not a positive word. If somebody is an agitator, they are trying to stir up something. And the reality of it was that in France especially, Jaurès was seen by the government and by many, one might say most Frenchmen as an agitator. He was trying to stop something that many of them believed was holy destiny. France had been badly beaten and badly embarrassed by the war 30 years before. And many Parisians and many Frenchmen believed that this was the opportunity to finally get back at Germany, finally avenge their embarrassment against Prussia. And Jaurès' warnings that this was going to be horrible was overwhelmed by this, again, the pronunciation escapes me, this incredible concept of Kriegsgefahrsustand. This idea, this spirit, this belief that war was not just good, it was needed. And even Jaurès' explanation that the people who are going to die is you, not the leaders aren't going to die, you're going to. Prophetic though they were ignored. And there was this attitude on both sides. Austria-Hungary had it, Serbia had it, although not quite as much. Russia had it, Germany had it, France had it. England was, they were very English at that particular point, but there was this attitude of, this is going to be essentially a holy war, and B, it's not going to last very long. It's going to be quick. It's going to be over like that, because God is on our side. Jaurès was buried on August 4th, 1914. His funeral was well noted throughout the year, throughout the world, media throughout the world. But it was also suppressed as a story. Why? Because August 4th, 1914, the day Jean Jaurès was buried, was also the same day that Germany invaded France. Invaded Belgium, and World War I really kicked off. Jaurès is one of those people in history that we don't really know. I mean, reality of it is, I could be mispronouncing his name and nobody would care. I'm not, but I could be. His existence on the stage of the world at that moment was important and could have been pivotal. And yet he was assassinated because a French nationalist believed that he was trying to prevent a war that was going to glorify France. And he wasn't the only one who felt that way. It's a little unnerving if you think about it, and it's a little disturbing when you watch what's happening today. This is, of course, where I want to go with this. The Council of Churches in Ukraine has called for a no-fly zone. The Council of Churches has called for a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Follow me here. Religious leaders in Ukraine and in Europe are calling for other people, because last time I checked, the World Council of Churches and the Ukrainian Council of Churches don't have any fighter planes. Have called for other people to man the no-fly zone, which is, for all practical purposes, a declaration of war. You understand that. If we establish a no-fly zone, that means that you have to enforce it. You can't just say, no-fly zone, you can't fly here, and then let them fly through, can you? So if you have a no-fly zone and somebody tries to fly through it, what do you have to do? You have to attack them, which makes this an act of war. And so when the World Council of Churches, the Ukrainian Council of Churches, calls for a no-fly zone, the Council of Churches, the religious leaders of the day, the peacemakers, blessed be the peacemakers, are calling for war. And if that's not Kriegsgefahrsustand, I don't know what is. When the very people who are supposed to stand for peace, when the very people who are supposed to say, wait a minute, back up, take your time, think about things, are doing that, the ghost of Jean Jaurès stands on that corner and says, are we sure about this? This morning in the Seattle newspapers, Seattle Times especially, we published this graphic, which caused some consternation and discussion between the Milsurp writer and Rod and Bill and I, because it's a topic that I talked about last week. Kind of blown it up here a little bit for you, but what it says is the low-yield nuclear warhead that's taken on big significance with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it talks about the W-76-2, a new nuclear warhead in the U.S. arsenal, approved by Congress under Donald Trump, that places a premium on a limited nuclear war, and it's getting a closer look because of the Ukrainian conflict. By the way, it's fielded on 8 submarines that are based here at Bangor. In essence, what it is it's simply a warhead that's been reduced. The secondary section of the warhead, and I'm not going to go into that. You can Google that if you want, but there's a primary and a secondary in a thermonuclear warhead. You can Google it up yourself. But the estimated number of warheads is somewhere between 25 and 50, depending on what we're doing. The number's actually classified. But in essence, a W-76-2 has an estimated delivery weight of between 5 and 8 kilotons, or 5,000 to 8,000 tons of TNT, which is smaller by at least a third than the Hiroshima bomb. Our normal weapon, the W-88, has a 475 kiloton range, and the W-76-1 is a 90 kiloton. None of these, by the way, are the weapons that I worked with, so I know nothing about them. They are, of course, based on the Trident D5 LE missile, which is carried aboard some of the 8 Ohio-class SSBNs that are based here. This was all run in the Seattle Times today because, well, maybe it's time to talk about this. Maybe it's time to bring this up that, hey, we now have small tactical nuclear weapons aboard ballistic missile submarines, which makes them, as I said the other day, more likely to be used. Putin is bringing his forces online, as we know. And even the National Enquirer running this headline. And of course, it's the National Enquirer. Should take it for what it's worth. World War III is just weeks away. Nuclear apocalypse over Ukraine. Why crazed Putin can't back down. A-bomb targets in your state are exposed. 5 steps you must take now to ensure survival. Yes, I get it. It's pandering to the low information voter. I understand that. But I also know this. When people who should be talking about what can we do to stop this are talking about starting it, when people who should be talking about we need to back off, when people who should be talking about peace are talking about war, those sorts of things become more and more and more by the day possible. Now is not the time to be quiet, folks. Now is not the time to go, well, it's patriotic. Is it? The people who are pushing you to support going to war with Russia over Ukraine aren't going to sacrifice anything. They have bunkers, they have money, they have power and influence. You have children to sacrifice for their desires. It is literally the same warning Jean Jaurès gave you on July 31st, 1914. He was so hated for preaching the idea that this was insane, that they shot and killed him. Nationalists, French nationalists, shot and killed him. Today, if you don't jump on the bandwagon, the TikTok bandwagon of war calling, you're going to be ostracized. You're going to be laughed at. You're going to be said to be unpatriotic, a Trump lover, a racist, bigot. But the truth of the matter is that you're right. War is insane. War is nuts, and it's not going to be quick. You understand that? Both sides are planning for a protracted nuclear war. Not a full-out 36-minute exchange and they're not planning for that. They don't even think that's going to happen. It's insane. And if Jean Jaurès was here today, he's not, because he's buried, what would he say to us? I think he would say the same thing he said then. You're crazy. You're going to get millions of people killed for absolutely nothing. The one thing that hasn't changed is those of us that have chosen to speak against the idea of going to war are going to be ridiculed, complained about, because we're going to be called unpatriotic. I served this country, gave my knee to this country. Others have given their lives. I get it. I'm going to be called unpatriotic. I'm going to be called not willing to stand up for freedom. Am I the one not willing to stand up for freedom? Or the people who are wanting this war, the people who are going to use this war, just like Jean Jaurès said in 1914, to gain even more power over me? History tells me that it's the latter. That's why it is not time to be silenced. It's time to speak up. It is time to say what we believe. Because if we don't, believe me, there's going to be a war. And that war is not going to be quick. It's not going to be cheap. It's going to be easy. Millions of people, millions, going to die.